Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying Mouse so far, insofar as you can enjoy a story about one of the worst events in human history. I am a huge fan of this work for a lot of reasons. It's typically one of the first graphic novels that wins people over if they think graphic novels are childish or silly. This is clearly not childish or silly, and I believe very effective. Now, up to this point, we have not really gotten very technical in our readings or our analysis. I've mostly asked you for your personal opinions. What do you notice? What do you think? And that's partly been on purpose. We started out, this is a very strange term. This would have been a little different if we'd been in the classroom together. But starting out with Chinese poetry, and we can't actually talk about it in person, makes it a little tricky, right? But now that we're getting into more familiar terrain, graphic novels, eventually we'll be getting to novels themselves, short stories, you're familiar with the art form a little more. And so we're going to dial up the, for lack of a better word, sophistication. This is a literary program, or a comparative literary program. And a lot of what we do doesn't depend on a certain kind of vocabulary, but it's a lot more helpful. It's the same way in every field. It doesn't matter what you do, computer software, biology, journalism. There are terms in each field which are not code. It's not like if you don't speak the terms themselves, you can't do it. But it helps to focus our thoughts a little bit. Reminds us what it is exactly we're looking for. So today I'm going to go over how to study and talk about comics. Now, it's an approach that really you can use across art forms, and we'll see this a little more when we get into fiction itself. But today I'm going to introduce terms. I'm going to walk you through an analysis of one part of the text, and I will be looking for you to do something similar, not the same. It's an acquired skill, just like anything else, over the next couple of weeks. If you find it tough going, that's fine. One of the misconceptions about novels or graphic novels, comics, painting, is that it's easy. You look at a painting, you like it, you move on, right? And that's definitely one way of accessing it. But you can also sit and think about it for a very, very long time. There's a lot there to look at. And the degree of sophistication of your observations and stuff depends on the kind of time you're willing to dedicate to it. So we'll see where we end up with that. But let's get into the introduction. How to talk about comics, or really for that matter, many other art forms, as we will see soon. Now, what we're going to be practicing is what we call close reading, which is exactly what it sounds like. You are reading something closely, which means you're going to spend some time on it. The best way I can think of to describe this is if you've ever been to an art museum before, there's different ways to go about it, right? So my wife is French, and I'm sort of fortunate in that I've now had the chance to go to France quite a few times and live there for a year even. That also means I've been able to go to some pretty incredible museums. I've been to the Louvre now like 4 or 5 times, I think. Now, the first time anyone goes to the Louvre, they pretty much do the greatest hits, right? The Mona Lisa, whatever is famous. You look at your guide, you get there as quickly as possible, you see as much as you can in like 4 hours, you get out, right? Perfectly acceptable. My favorite visit to the museum, though, was one year when I was working on my doctoral exams, and I decided to just go to one wing of the museum, right? And I walked through, I picked out the paintings that made me go, huh, that's interesting. I didn't even ask why. I just looked at them. Huh, that's interesting, right? I wrote them down, got some lunch, and came back and spent probably 20 or 30 minutes in front of each painting, just looking, making some notes about what I had noticed, what was interesting. What happens when you spend that much time looking at something, reading something? It's not that all of a sudden, quote-unquote, deep meanings, which I hate that term, come out. It's that you notice things you would not have noticed at first. So if you just run to the Mona Lisa, you may go, wow, that's small, or holy cow, there's a lot of people here, before you run on, right? if you sit there, you might start to notice things like, wow, the texture of the paint is not what I expected. Or, that color scheme is awfully bland. Something like that. It's the sort of thing you have to wait for because our brains are programmed, these days anyway, to make conclusions extremely quickly. This is what happens when we read the news, for example, right? This is why I don't read much news right now. You come away in a panic because you get a headline basically saying we're all doomed, and for the next hour you feel like you're doomed. You don't really spend some time looking at the wording and wondering where the sources are coming from. We just sort of make a conclusion quickly. Close reading is the opposite of that. Here's how it goes. Observation first. If you are in the sciences, it's a similar, obviously not exactly the same, but similar approach, right? The vast majority of any work you do in the sciences is examination, is observation. You take samples, you run tests. If you're an astronomer, you run exhaustively everything you've seen through mathematical analyses, right? Same thing here. The vast majority of your time is going to be spent not just going, hey, what does this mean? But okay, what exactly am I seeing here? Are there a lot of words on the page? Are there not, right? From there, you are going to make interpretations, right? But for the rest of this course, whenever I ask you to do an assignment like this, I want you to spend the vast majority of your time on observation. Your grade will depend not on how cool your interpretations are, right? But on the number of observations you make, because it shows how much time you're spending there. Now, interpretation after you've done a lot of observation is where you're asking questions like, why does this matter that I'm seeing this? Or what can I say about this? Interpretation is not figuring out exactly what the thing is. You don't read a poem and now you suddenly know exactly what the poet meant, right? Interpretation is figuring out exactly what it is you're thinking. But it's not random, okay? This is the trick. Whenever you say, well, it's all interpretation, that tends to mean to most people, that's whatever you want it to be. No, it's not whatever you want it to be because you've made so many observations that you're clearly paying attention to how the work is constructed, right? You can point someone to, well, it's my interpretation because look at all the stuff I see. Can't you see it too? Okay? You don't just go, well, that's probably about aliens, right? Because there's nothing in the text anywhere that demonstrates that. You have to be able to show where you're seeing it. This is the sort of overlooked skill with a lot of these things. Now, it's not 100% necessary to use special terms, but I do find it helpful because it does focus, like I said in the introduction here, your thoughts a little bit. The easiest one is the panel. When you're reading a comic or a graphic novel, the little square inside of which something is happening is called a panel. A bunch of panels put together is a sequence, which is fairly obvious, a sequence of panels. From there's the interesting one. This is a very comic-specific term, the gutter. The gutter is the little space in between panels. So in this one, Vladik says, Artie, come to hold this a minute while I saw. And Artie makes a little sound snark. Then there's a space in between one panel and the next. And then he says, why do you cry, Artie? Hold better on the wood. The space in between those panels is called the gutter. Now, Scott McCloud, the comic artist and writer of Understanding Comics, notes that this is usually an indication of time having passed or of someone's focus shifting. The mind sort of fills in the gaps. This is what McCloud calls closure, because you're closing up two events into one seamless whole, right? So the two images are not exactly the same thing, right? Your mind is making them work together. Vladik is in the picture holding a saw, and the next thing we see, he's talking with Artie and giving him some advice, right? But your brain is putting those together so that they seem to make sense. And time has passed, right? So between one panel and the next, something is happening. Transition between panels. This is the little image on the left is from Scott McCloud's book. He identifies 6 kinds of transition. And don't worry, I'm going to introduce these. I'm going to post this PDF to the website so you can read it on your own time. Don't feel like, oh no, I'm not going to keep up. Don't worry about it. Go back and look at it later. The first is called Moment to Moment. It's a very brief amount of time between an action, right? So the image up there is of someone blinking their eyes. Then we have action to action. There's one subject, but the time is usually a little further apart, and the focus is on an action taking place. Number 3 is subject to subject. We have one scene, but we're moving between subjects in the scene. Number 4 is scene to scene. Usually 2 different times and 2 different things happening. So in this one, there's a guy talking, and then it says 10 years later, and we see a house. Now, the 2 images are not the same person. They're not even the same scene. Number 5 is aspect to aspect. It's one scene, but different aspects of that scene. You've probably seen this in various other graphic novels. You'll see an image of a forest, and then a close-up of a bird, and then a river running. Now, none of those things are the same, we would think of it as a subject, but it's all different, with aspects, but different views of the same thing. And number 6 is a non sequitur, which is just, right? There's an image of Nixon followed by squiggles. Your brain can make something out of it if you want, but there's no obvious logical connection. Okay, then we get to line. McCloud talks a lot. He has a whole chapter dedicated to how a line, the way the line is drawn, communicates information to us. So one of his examples is Charles Gould's Dick Tracy comic. The lines here are dark. They're usually very angular. Look at Dick Tracy's face. It looks like a square, like a hard square. Everyone's angles are very hard. The lines are dark and black, right? It's meant to, and that's a way of communicating that the world in which we are is a very adult world. It's hard. Then we got Donald Duck, right? There's nothing about those lines that seems angular or adult or dark. They're rounded, or the angles are rounded. They're not very dark. But then we get to Tintin, which is he's on the bottom right there. I don't know if you've ever read Tintin, but it's kind of a combination of the two, right? So the angles are very soft, very rounded, very Donald Duck-y, almost childlike, right? But the lines themselves are dark and black. Drawn by the Belgian comic Hergé, who sort of learned from the Japanese, but this is called a clear line style. So there's no real blending in background and foreground or character and his surroundings. They're clearly demarcated. The head is very, very clearly drawn off from everything else. But the angles are very childlike, right? So it's a combination of the two. It's very adult, but it's also very, very, well, I keep using the word childlike. It's the best one I can think of. Shading. In this sequence here, for example, the background is entirely black except for a swastika, right? That's interesting because the shading there, it's not necessarily night, it's just black, right? And it's sometimes Spiegelman uses this sort of cross-hatching. You'll see in the top left panel, one of the character with her back to us, it's just a series of diagonal lines. Now, the other characters have suits that are inked in. They're black, not her. But there's someone else in the picture with a white suit with no shading at all, right? So the way shading is done can communicate meaning. Background and foreground. This is a painting term. And sometimes comics intentionally emulate paintings, like this sequence here in Maus. There's a lot of stuff happening behind the characters, right? We see someone sitting on a fountain. We see trees, bushes, birds in the sky. Now, the advantage to writing, or observing rather, a graphic novel is that nothing is there by accident. Everything you're seeing, someone had to decide to draw. A photograph, sometimes you can capture things by accident. Film even too. Of course, a photographer or a cinematographer might argue with that. But I think we could all agree that if you're actually drawing it yourself on the page, there's a lot less room for coincidence or accident. So whatever you're seeing, someone actually drew. That's something to keep in mind. It's there on purpose. Then we get to words. What's interesting, or one of the things that's interesting about comics, is that it's a mix of words and images. And the following slides are all from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. He identifies a couple of different ways that words and pictures go together. The first is word specific, where the pictures illustrate but don't significantly add to the text. The second is picture specific, which is similar, but in this case, the pictures carry the meaning and the words don't. Then we get duo specific, where they're basically doing the same thing. You get this a lot in superhero novel or comics. I used to wonder this when I was a kid and would read some of these once in a while. I'd go, why is this person saying the exact thing that's happening to them? Then we get additive, where the words amplify what we see on the page. Like the guy on the right, how do you like my new threads, babe? Well, we know exactly what he's trying to communicate, but the words make it even more ridiculous. Parallel combinations. Something is happening, the picture is doing something, and what's happening around it could be voices that person has heard, it could be voices from somewhere else. So it's a part of the scene, there's a logical connection, but they don't necessarily meet up. Then we get a montage where the words are actually a part of the picture. And finally, what McLeod says is the most common, interdependent, where both the picture and the words are carrying some kind of meaning. They may not be doing the same thing, but they're doing something that creates an overall effect. So like the guy on the top right, this is all I need to stop him. Now the words are saying something the image is not necessarily conveying, but the two together are doing something interesting. Okay, here's the term overview. Panel, sequence, gutter, transition, word, image combinations. Then I just sort of grouped the last ones together. Line, shading, background, and foreground. Now, what the heck, right? We're supposed to have all of these terms in our head every time we look at a page. Is that it? No, that's not it. Only the most ridiculously hardcore scholars I've met are incapable of reading a book or looking at a painting without that level of analysis going on at the same time. It usually doesn't happen at the same time. If you've done it enough, like when I read a poem or a novel now, things will leap out at me in a certain way, and I will analyze them pretty quickly, just sort of instinctively. But I'm perfectly capable of reading a science fiction novel or a graphic novel without analyzing every page. Close reading is a conscious decision. I'm going to stop and think about something. Now, this is where individual choice becomes important. You're not focusing on the thing the novel is talking about. You're focusing on something that struck you. Anything. It could just be, wow, this is a weird page. You don't have to have a reason. Just note it, right? Remember my visit to the Louvre. I didn't pick a painting because I said, this is a meaning that I agree with. I just said, that's weird, or interesting, or beautiful. And then I go back and look at it in greater depth. That's what you're doing here. Just enjoying the work is a part of the experience. It can sometimes be the whole part. But for the purpose of analysis, you're looking for something that sticks out at you, and then you analyze it. You're not going to be able to look at every single term in depth, right? The best kind of close reading will have you spending a ton of time just on one item. Like, wow, the line composition shifts so dramatically over the course of this page. Things like that. So let's go on to an actual walkthrough of what I'm talking about here. Okay, here we go. This is one page from last week's text. You should have already read it by now. If you haven't, keep going and try to read it. Observations. There are 6 panels in the sequence, and one that's sort of a background drawing of Vladek. They're all rectangular, most lying lengthwise across the page, and one is vertical. So I should point out here that there's no dumb observations. There's a tendency to, in an assignment, in a class like this, to try to be impressive. Like, I'm going to do something that no one else can do, right? You start small. It doesn't matter what you observe here. If you see a thing, write it down, right? because you never know where it's going to lead. Sometimes it can lead somewhere super important. There's a lot of diagonal lines in the panels that provide texture. The path of the bullet shot at Vladek crosses the gutter between panels. This is unusual. Comics are like films in that they construct a world you're supposed to forget. You're helping to construct the world, basically, right? You're just there. The images sort of blend together just like they do in a film, and you sink into it. When something happens to jar you out of that, it's very unusual, and it's worth noting. We start with a subject-to-subject transition. Sorry for the pause there. I'd forgotten something. We then go to a scene-to-scene transition and ultimately to subject-to-subject again. So the top left one, though, is a subject-to-subject that crosses a huge time frame. The bottom part is much shorter. Vladek's speech, when he is talking with those trying to help him in the past, lacks the odd phrasing and grammatical errors of his present-day self. You can make observations about words as well. I did not necessarily put those in there because we're going to be looking a lot more at what words specifically are doing when we talk about novels and short stories in the next unit. Here, because graphic novels are different because of the combination of words and images, I'm going to focus a little more on the pictures. But here it's interesting. I think it's interesting. You'll notice when it's Vladek talking to Artie, he says things like, "I ran quick inside and thought all night different things, what could happen to us." This is not the way we usually speak. But in the past, no problem. "My name's Spiegelman. There's a friend of my family named Orbach in Lublin. I met him when I was here for army training." No grammatical problems because it's in his language. It's in Polish, but we're reading it in English. Okay, that's worth keeping in mind. So there's just 5 observations. Now, I'm going to put in something else called observation of observations. Okay, so this is just you pick one thing or a few things that really strike you. For me, for example, it's the bullet. It's coming across the gutter between panels, and that's a very, very unusual thing to do. It's even in just the world of this comic, it doesn't happen very much. Now, we don't even ask what it means yet. We're just observing something else about it. So it crosses the gutter. Now, in this case, I'm asking myself, what is the gutter exactly? What is it doing? Right? Well, if you go back and look at the slide earlier on the gutter, the space between panels, it usually indicates the passage of time or the passage of one focus to another. Now, for something to cross that means it is not a part of the flow of the story. It's not a part of the time of the story, or not a normal part anyway. It also means in this case that there's no visible shooter, and it's not a part of the flow of the narrative. Within the world of the comic, it could as easily come from a different time. Now, clearly, I'm not saying it comes from the future, but it is undeniable that it is crossing through the normal flow of time in the comic. Number 2, the transitions indicate a shorter and shorter time frame. First, we have present-day Vladek to past Vladek. Then we have Vladek in conversation with some people to Vladek in conversation with someone else. Could be any time. Could be the same time, but the way it's drawn, it's not clear, right? Then the last 5 panels are all occurring over one short sequence, which is Vladek going outside to urinate but having to run back inside. Then we get to the very bottom, and we have this final thought here. Vladek says, "And I thought all night different things, what could happen to us." So we go, he runs outside to urinate, he gets shot at, he ducks back inside, and then it says, "and thought all night." So the time is going from a long passage of time to a short passage of time, back out to a long passage of time. Now, again, this is stuff that sticks out to me. I think it's pretty easy to point to it. If you say, what are you noticing? I think we could go into some real depth here. But it's not the thing, right? There's not one thing that is so important that you must see. interpretation. Here's where we get into some tricky territory. These are a couple of questions I will give you to help to think about what your observations mean. Please remember, you are not explaining, here's what Art Spiegelman, the graphic novelist, wants me to know. One of the things that we talk quite a bit about in literature is that, or not quite talk quite a bit about, but sort of just assume at this point, is that you don't have access to exactly what the writer of a text means you to think. Now, you might in an essay, a newspaper article, in a work of art like a novel or a graphic novel, we don't have access to the artist's thoughts. We have access to what they wrote, but you cannot say, well, Spiegelman is telling me here that this is your observation and your interpretation. Now, it is based on what Spiegelman did. We spend a lot of time on observations as a way of grounding our interpretations so that they are valid, they're easy to explain to people, and what we get out of them is not just, I don't know, whatever, right? You can make lots of observations to back them up. So here, for example, we have, how does this compare to other sequences or panels in the text? Is it different? Is it the same? Why does this matter? What is the effect created by a single observation? And how do several observations work together to create something different? There's other questions you could ask. These are just three I'm going to suggest are helpful. I'm going to choose one and demonstrate how I would go about it. So, I'm talking about one observation. Going back to the bullet again. It comes from an unseen shooter and it crosses panels through the gutter in a way that is as jarring for the reader as for Vladek. Why? Because Vladek's world, it works a certain way, and all of a sudden it doesn't. He's being shot at for trying to pee. That's just ridiculous. There's no logic to it. If he was trying to escape, it would make sense. But he's not. He's just peeing and someone shot at him. And for us as the viewer and the reader, it's the same thing. We're used to the panels flowing together a certain way, and then all of a sudden something is crossing through them. In this way, we experience, in a much smaller way, what the subjects of the comic experience. The enemy is everywhere and could act at any time, even beyond what we would consider the possible. Okay, so that's an interpretation. And a good interpretation is one that is both well-grounded in observation and arguable. I mean, if I say, well, the panel's black on the background, well, no one can argue with that. But if I say what I just said, you might totally disagree with it. You might point out, for example, that Vladek's hat passes through the gutter as well. What does that mean? Good point. Let's talk about it. The work of art, a good work of art, should generate discussion. It should generate different experiences. So that's close reading. That's a very short introduction to close reading. It's the sort of thing you have to do a lot and in a lot of depth over the course of years to really get comfortable with. I'm not expecting over the next 5 weeks for all of you to just nail it. I will expect to see some effort. I will restructure some of our quizzes and assignments so that I'm seeing more observations on your part, that you can actually spend some time with one sequence of panels or with one scene in a story and make some observations and possibly some good interpretations about them. Interpretations are obviously the tricky part. What does that even mean, interpretation? What do you mean by how is it different, right? That's a qualitative thing. It's difficult to explain in depth. I can really only do it in conversation with what you're writing. So, get to it this week. Do the best you can with the terms I've given you for the comics and the ways I will be expecting you to analyze them.